Something happened inside the blood of a nation that historians never saw coming. The Zulu people, famous for warriors, for Shaka, for courage that shook empires, may not have started where we think they started at all. If this story hits you the way it hit me, don't just watch it quietly. Say the word roots in the comments, so I know you're following this journey with me, because what comes next changes everything you thought you knew about where the Zulu truly came from. For centuries, the story felt simple, clean, almost too clean. We were told the Zulu nation rose from a small clan in southern Africa, a clan that grew strong under one man, Shaka Zulu, a leader so fierce, so brilliant in war, that he turned a tiny group of people into one of the most feared nations on the continent. That is the story most people know. Shaka builds an army. Shaka builds a kingdom. Shaka builds a bloodline that becomes the Zulu we know today. It is a powerful story. It is also incomplete. Because history is not only about kings and battles. History also lives inside something much smaller. Something you cannot see with your eyes. Something hidden inside every human cell. DNA. And when researchers began looking closer at the deep ancestry of southern African peoples, including the Zulu, they found threads that stretched back far beyond Shaka. Far beyond one kingdom, far beyond one century. They found threads that stretched back thousands of years, and those threads tell a very different story than the one we grew up hearing. To understand why this matters, you have to understand something most people never think about. Nations are not just built by kings. Nations are built by migration, by mixing, by waves of people moving across land, meeting other people, sometimes fighting them, sometimes marrying them, sometimes simply living beside them for generations, until their children carried both bloodlines without even knowing it. Southern Africa was no different. Long before Shaka was born, long before the word Zulu meant a kingdom, there were other people already living on that land, people who had been there for tens of thousands of years, some of the oldest human populations on Earth, the Khoisan. You may have heard of them by their click languages, sounds that click and pop in the middle of words, sounds found almost nowhere else on the planet. Some researchers believe these languages are among the oldest surviving. The Khoisan were not new arrivals. Genetic studies suggest their ancestors were among the earliest branches of the human family tree. In simple words, some of the very first humans to walk this earth left descendants who were still living in southern Africa when other groups began arriving much, much later. And one of those later groups were the ancestors of the Bantu-speaking peoples, the same broad family of peoples that the Zulu nation would eventually emerge from. This is where the story gets interesting, because the Bantu expansion is one of the biggest population movements in African history. Thousands of years ago, groups of farming, ironworking communities began spreading out from a region in West and Central Africa. Slowly, generation by generation, they moved south and east across the continent. They carried new skills, new tools, new languages, and as they moved, they met people who were already there. This is the part textbooks often skip. They met the Khoisan, and in many regions, instead of one group disappearing and one group taking over completely, something more complicated happened. They mixed. Genetic studies on southern African populations, including groups connected to the Zulu, have found traces of Khoisan ancestry inside people whose culture is Bantu. Not a small forgotten detail, a real, measurable, biological connection. Now pause on that for a moment. The people who are seen today as the descendants of Shaka's warriors, the people whose name became a symbol of strength across the world, may carry inside them a genetic memory. A memory of the very first people to ever live on that land. That is not a small twist. That is history whispering a secret it never got to finish telling. But here's where you need to keep listening, because this is only the first layer. There is more waiting underneath. If a story like this makes your skin feel a little electric, stay with me, because the next part is where identity gets even more complicated and even more human. For a long time, national identities were built like walls. You were either this group or that group. You either belonged or you didn't. Kings needed clear boundaries. Clans needed loyalty. Wars needed sides. So over time, especially during the rise of Shaka's kingdom, many smaller clans were absorbed into one larger identity. People who once had different origins, different smaller histories, different bloodlines, were brought together under one name, Zulu. This is not unusual in history. Nations are almost always built this way. Rome absorbed conquered peoples. England absorbed Celts, Saxons, and Normans. Empires rise by pulling different threads into one flag. The Zulu kingdom did something similar. Under military pressure and under Shaka's expanding power, many smaller groups were pulled into the Zulu identity. Some willingly, some by force, some through marriage and alliance. Over time, their children stopped identifying with their old, smaller clans and simply became Zulu. This means the Zulu identity we know today is not one single bloodline stretching back in a straight line. It is more like a river formed by many smaller streams joining together, and DNA studies support this river idea. Genetic diversity among Zulu populations shows signs of multiple ancestral sources, not one single isolated group that stayed untouched for thousands of years. In simple words, being Zulu was never only about blood. It became about belonging. That idea alone should shake something inside you, because it means identity is not always what we assume it is. Sometimes it is chosen, sometimes it is built, sometimes it is forced. And sometimes it becomes real simply because enough people choose to carry it forward. But there is still a deeper mystery buried in all of this. If you strip away kingdoms, if you strip away clan names, if you strip away the wars and the borders, what connects modern Zulu people to ancient human history? This is where the story reaches back further than most people expect, not just centuries, thousands of years. Some of the deepest genetic studies on African populations suggest that southern Africa holds the oldest genetic lineages. This region isn't just part of human history. Some researchers believe it may be closer to where humans diversified. That means when scientists study the DNA of people living in this region today, including Zulu communities, they are not only reading a story about African history, they are reading fragments of the oldest human stories. Feel that for a second. A name that the world associates with 19th century warriors and battles is also connected, through deep ancestry, to some of the earliest chapters of human existence. History textbooks rarely explain it this way. They usually start the Zulu story with Shaka, a powerful leader, a turning point. But turning points are not beginnings. They are chapters in the middle of something much older. If your mind is already trying to reorganize everything you thought you knew, don't stop them now. Type one word in the comments, Ancestry, so I know this truth is landing the way it should, because the next part is where science and identity collide in an even more emotional way. Let's talk about what colonization did to this story. When European explorers, missionaries, and colonial powers arrived in southern Africa, they didn't just bring weapons and trade, they brought stories too. And often, those stories were shaped to fit their own goals. Many early colonial writers described African societies using simple, sometimes distorted categories. Tribes were treated like fixed, unchanging blocks, as if the Zulu, the Xhosa, the Sotho, and other groups had always existed exactly as they were seen in the 1800s, frozen in time with no deeper history before that. This idea was convenient for colonial powers. If African societies could be labeled as simple and separate, it became easier to justify controlling them, dividing them, and rewriting their land ownership and their laws. But real history is almost never that simple. Modern historians and geneticists studying southern Africa now understand that ethnic identities were far more fluid. Groups merged, languages blended, communities absorbed outsiders, marriages crossed lines that colonial administrators later tried to draw as permanent borders. In other words, the version of Zulu identity that got written into colonial records was a simplified snapshot, not the full, complicated living reality. And this matters deeply today, because identity built from snapshots still shapes how people see themselves and each other. Some boundaries created division where there was connection. Genetics is now offering a quiet correction to that story, not by erasing Zulu identity, but by revealing how much richer and older it actually is. So who were the Zulu, really, before Shaka's rise? Before the kingdom? Before the wars? There were smaller communities living across what is now KwaZulu-Natal. Farmers, herders, families connected to a wider Nguni-speaking world, part of the much larger Bantu-speaking family. These communities were shaped by centuries of movement, trade, and contact. Some historians believe there was regular interaction between early Nguni-speaking groups and Khoisan communities, long before Shaka's era, through trade, marriage, and shared land. This means the original Zulu clan was already a product of mixing, already a blend of different ancestral threads. There was no single pure starting point. There was only a long, layered process of people meeting people, generation after generation. And once you understand that, the idea of a pure bloodline starts to dissolve, not just for the Zulu, for almost every nation in human history. This is where the emotional weight of this story really lands, because so many of us grow up believing our identity is simple. My family is this, my people are that, my blood is pure and unchanged since the beginning of time. But history and science tell a different truth. We are not single threads, we are woven cloth. Every nation carries hidden layers underneath it, layers shaped by migration, mixing, survival, and choice. The Zulu story is a powerful example of this. It involves an iconic identity wrapped around a genetic reality that is far older and more diverse. If this idea is starting to change how you think about identity itself, share this video with someone. Share it with someone who has ever felt confused about where they truly come from. Because this story is bigger than one nation. It is about all of us. Now, let's go even deeper, because there is one more layer to uncover. Some genetic research on southern African populations has revealed something else surprising. Traces of ancestry connected not only to nearby groups, but also patterns linked to deep lineages. These lineages stretch far beyond the region itself. This doesn't mean the Zulu came from somewhere unexpected. It means their genetic story connects to the bigger story of how humans spread across the entire continent, long before written history began. In simple words, when you look at Zulu DNA today, you're looking at a small window into the much larger story of humanity finding its way. Finding its way across an entire continent, over tens of thousands of years, that is a humbling thought. A group of people, known worldwide for a short but explosive chapter of military history, Shaka's era, are also carriers of one of the oldest human stories on Earth. Both things are true at the same time. The proud, fierce, recent history of Shaka's kingdom, and the deep, ancient history written into DNA. History textbooks usually only tell one of these stories. Science is now helping us tell both. And this raises a bigger question, one that reaches far beyond the Zulu people themselves. How many other nations, tribes, and ethnic identities around the world carry similar hidden layers? How many pure bloodlines that people are proud of are actually rivers formed from many streams? The truth is, almost all of them. Human history is not made of separate boxes. It is made of movement, of contact, of communities meeting other communities, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, and almost always leaving behind some trace in the blood of the generations that followed. The Zulu story simply makes this truth incredibly visible because it combines a famous recent history with genetic evidence stretching back to the earliest chapters of human existence. Few identities in the world carry both extremes so clearly, side by side. This is also why some historians and geneticists caution against oversimplifying the findings. They remind us that DNA tells us about ancestry and biological connections across generations. It does not erase or replace culture, language, memory, and identity, which are built by people. Choices and shared history define us, not only genes. In other words, being Zulu is not only about DNA, it is about language. It is about shared stories passed down through generations. It is about a name that people carry with pride, built through real events, struggles, and courage. DNA simply reveals how deep the roots underneath that identity actually go, and that raises one final, powerful thought to carry with you. If a nation is strong and proud as the Zulu carries such deep, mixed, ancient roots, then maybe the whole idea of pure, separate, unchanging identities was never really true for anyone. Maybe every nation on Earth is a river, not a single stream. Maybe every proud name we carry, every flag, every tribe, every bloodline we believe is simple, is actually built from thousands of years of human beings finding each other and mixing, surviving and passing something forward, without ever fully knowing what they were creating. The Zulu people did not simply appear under Shaka's leadership. They were shaped by time. They were shaped by tens of thousands of years of human movement across southern Africa, shaped by contact with some of the oldest human populations on Earth, shaped by merging, shaped by choosing to belong to something larger than any single bloodline. Shaka gave them a kingdom. But history and DNA remind us that their story began long before. So the next time you hear the word Zulu, don't just picture warriors and battles, picture something much bigger. Picture thousands of years of human beings walking and meeting, mixing and surviving across one of the oldest inhabited lands on Earth. Picture a river of ancestry quietly flowing underneath one of the most powerful names. And ask yourself this: if a story this deep was hiding inside a name we thought we understood, what other names, what other nations and identities are still waiting for their true story? Because maybe none of us are as simple as the stories we were told. Maybe we are all rivers, and maybe it is time we finally learn to trace them.